A wealthy business tycoon discovers a young boy at his father's burial site. "Sorry, I didn't mean to disturb Grandpa," the boy says. The man offers a somber smile. "You're at the wrong grave, kid," he responds, then freezes in shock at the boy's next words. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and hit the like button to support our channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. The cemetery was eerily silent, with a chilling stillness that lingered despite the late afternoon sun. The sound of gravel crunching softly under Lucas Grant's polished shoes echoed as he walked between rows of headstones, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. It marked the 4th anniversary of his father's passing, and as usual, he visited alone. He paused before a familiar headstone, Thomas Grant, beloved husband and father, and hesitated. The lilies felt unnaturally heavy. There were things he wished he could express, a tangle of accusations and confessions he could never unravel. But today, like every year, he remained silent. He knelt to place the flowers, meticulously arranging them as if neatness could conceal the unspoken words. Then he noticed the boy, kneeling a few feet away, partially hidden by the shadow of a marble angel. The boy appeared no older than 10. He was slender and pale, wearing an oversized hoodie that hung off his shoulders. He gazed at the grave, lips moving silently, and it took Lucas a moment to realize he was apologizing. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered, head bowed. "I didn't mean to bother you, Grandpa." Lucas stood up, brow furrowing. The words didn't add up. No one else was buried there, no other name on the stone. He cleared his throat, and the boy flinched, looking up with wide eyes. "Hey," Lucas said, keeping his voice calm. "I think you got the wrong grave." The boy blinked at him, confusion flickering across his face, before shaking his head slowly. "No," he mumbled. "Mom said this is Grandpa's grave. She told me where to find it." Lucas's fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. This had to be a mistake. There was no way. The boy shifted, brushing dirt from his knees. His eyes darted between Lucas and the headstone, uncertain but determined. "Mom said you didn't want us," he said quietly. "She didn't want me to come, but I wanted to see." Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He stared, words failing him. And for a moment, all he could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of traffic. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out reason. "Wait!" Lucas managed, his voice raw. Who's your mom?" The boy hesitated, scuffing the toe of his sneaker against the gravel. "Sarah," he said, watching Lucas carefully. "Sarah Miller." The name struck Lucas like a blow. He hadn't heard it in over a decade, not since the summer that ended in shouting and slammed doors. He'd loved Sarah once, passionately and all at once, before his father's threats and his own ambitions tore them apart. And now this boy, Ethan, was looking at her with eyes too familiar to ignore. Sarah's eyes. His hair was the same dark brown Lucas saw in the mirror every morning, the same sharp jawline. Lucas's mouth went dry. He took a step back, boots scraping the gravel, but there was nowhere to go. His father's name stared back at him from the headstone, carved in clean lines. And it suddenly felt like a trap. "You're my son," Lucas whispered, the words barely holding together. Ethan's shoulders hunched, hands curling into the sleeves of his hoodie. "Mom didn't want me to find you," he mumbled. "She said you didn't care. But I wanted to know." A hollow ache settled under Lucas's ribs, a mix of rage and guilt, and something too raw to name. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was written plain as day in Ethan's face, and the way his chin lifted slightly when he was scared. "How long?" Lucas started, but the words broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "How long have you known?" "Since last year," Ethan admitted. "I found a picture of you and Mom in her closet. She got mad when I asked, said it didn't matter. But I looked you up online." His voice was small, almost apologetic. "I saw you on TV. You looked different, cold, polished. A stranger in a suit and tie, too busy making deals to think about anything or anyone else." Lucas dragged a hand over his mouth, trying to grasp reality. A son. He had a son. For 10 years, he'd been oblivious, throwing himself into work, cutting off the past because it was easier than facing it. And all that time, Sarah had been raising Ethan alone, with him none the wiser. "I didn't know," Lucas said finally, his voice hoarse. It sounded like an excuse even to him. "I swear if I'd known—" "Mom said you'd say that." Ethan cut in, almost whispering. "She said you pretend to care to make yourself feel better." His gaze fell to the ground, shoulders curling inward. "She said you left because you didn't want a family." Lucas flinched. The words stung more than they should have because some part of him knew Sarah would have every right to believe that. He'd walked away, after all, chosen the career his father pushed on him, let go of everything else. But not this. Not a son he never knew existed. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice steady. "Your mom was wrong," he said, the words quiet but certain. "I didn't know. I should have. I should have been there." Ethan didn't answer, shoulders stiff and defensive. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain, until Lucas's voice broke it again. "Your mom," he asked, fighting to keep his voice even. "Does she know you're here?" Ethan's chin dipped in a small, guilty shake of his head. "She's at work," he muttered. "I took the bus." His hands twisted in his sleeves, fingers white at the knuckles. "She's gonna be so mad." A shaky breath escaped Lucas, something almost like a laugh, but too close to a sob. The absurdity of it all. This 10-year-old who somehow found his way across the city alone to visit a grandfather he never knew, while his father, the one person who should have been there, still like a stranger in a suit, useless and dumbstruck. "Okay," Lucas said softly, clearing his throat. "Okay, let me drive you home. We can talk on the way." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the grave one last time before giving a small, reluctant nod. As they walked back to the car, Lucas stole a glance at his father's name on the headstone, 1,000 questions burning in the back of his mind. He'd get answers later. For now, there was only one thing that mattered. The boy trailing quietly beside him, small and scared and far braver than he'd ever been. The drive was quiet, punctuated only by the soughing of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Ethan in the passenger seat. Lucas's hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, knuckles pale against the leather. He'd thrown his coat over Ethan's shoulders as they walked the car, the fabric swallowing the boy completely. But Ethan hadn't protested. If anything, he'd seemed grateful for the warmth. The city blurred past, streets half familiar from years ago. Lucas's mind raced, questions piling up faster than he could sort through them. The disbelief had dulled, leaving a raw ache behind, and all he could focus on was getting answers. When they pulled up to a modest apartment complex on the edge of town, Ethan pointed out the building with a quiet, that one, and Lucas's pulse jumped. The parking lot was cracked and empty, a few bikes chained haphazardly to a railing. Not what he'd expected for Sarah, who'd once talked about opening a bookstore and traveling the world. They climbed the stairs in silence, Ethan lagging a step behind, small fingers twisted in the coat sleeves. On the third floor, Lucas stopped in front of a faded green door, hesitating. The apartment number was crooked, a few scratches marring the paint. He raised his hand, knocked twice. Footsteps approached, quick and light. The door cracked open, and Sarah stared at him through the gap, eyes widening in shock. For a moment, neither spoke. Lucas's breath caught, all the words he'd rehearsed on the drive over scattering. Sarah was older, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail, dark circles etched beneath her eyes, but she was still unmistakably her. "What?" Her voice came out hoarse. She cleared her throat, eyes flicking between him and Ethan. "What are you doing here? Can we talk?" Lucas managed, trying to keep his tone steady. "Please." Sarah's gaze shifted to Ethan, who peeked around Lucas's arm, face pinched with guilt. Her expression crumbled, and she exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping. Without a word, she unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. They stepped inside, and Lucas took in a small, tidy living room, the bookshelf crammed with well-worn novels, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. The couch was draped with a knitted blanket he half recognized. It was nothing like his sprawling penthouse, but it felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in years. "Go to your room, Ethan," Sarah murmured, her voice soft but firm. Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously at Lucas, But a look from Sarah had him shuffling down the hall without complaint. His door clicked shut, leaving him alone. As soon as he was out of sight, Sarah's expression hardened. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowed with something between anger and betrayal. "What do you want, Lucas?" "An explanation," he said, trying not to sound desperate. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. The sound sharp and brittle. "You don't get to ask that," she shot back. "Not after what you did." "What I did?" The accusation threw him off balance. "Sarah, I didn't even know." "How was I supposed to?" "You knew." Her voice trembled, but the glare stayed steady. "I wrote to you. I begged you to at least see him once. And you had your lawyer send back a letter saying you wanted nothing to do with us." Lucas's heart lurched. "What? No, that's not. I never got a letter." "Oh, cut the act," Sarah snapped. "I saw your signature at the bottom. Lucas. It was your name on that letter, telling me to move on and stop embarrassing myself." Her words were sharp, each one landing with a sting that left him reeling. He searched her face, half expecting to find a crack, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But Sarah's glare was unrelenting, a mix of pain and fury that left him no room to breathe. "I never wrote that," Lucas insisted, forcing the words out. "I swear, Sarah, I didn't even know about him." "If I had saved it," she interrupted, voice hollow. "It doesn't matter. It's too late." He flinched, a dozen arguments dying on his tongue. The air between them felt suffocating, thick with years of bitterness and unspoken truths. Lucas struggled to think past the chaos in his head. The realization that someone had intercepted Sarah's letters, that his father's lawyers might have forged that response. It made too much sense, the way his father had pushed him to break things off, the disdain in his eyes whenever Sarah's name came up. "Sarah," he tried softer, but she shook her head, backing away a step. "I don't want your apologies," she said, exhaustion bleeding through the anger. "Just stay away from him. You've done enough." Her voice cracked at the edges, and Lucas's throat tightened. "He's my son," he choked out, the words raw and unfamiliar. "I deserve a chance to know him." She laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "You deserve? Really? After 10 years of silence? After I watched him sit at the window every birthday, hoping you'd show up?" Her eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, fighting it back. "You don't get to just walk in and play hero now, Lucas." His fist clenched, nails biting into his palms. "Please," he said quieter. "I just want to make it right." Sarah's shoulders sagged, the fight seeming to drain out her all at once. For a moment, she looked so tired, he almost forgot how furious she was. Then she shook her head, stepping back toward the hallway. "Go," she muttered, "before he comes out." "Sarah, I said go." Her voice broke on the last word, eyes fixed on the floor. "You want a chance to be a father? Prove you're not the man I thought you were. Until then, stay away." The door swung open behind him, and Lucas stood frozen for a breath too long, throat tight and aching. But Sarah's glare left no room for argument. So he turned, shoulders heavy, and stepped out into the chill. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. Lucas barely slept. He spent most of the night pacing the length of his apartment, the intercepted letters replaying in his mind. The accusations, Sarah's hollow voice, the way Ethan's shoulders hunched when he'd asked his mom was mad. Every word clawed at him, raw and unrelenting. By morning, he had a plan, even if it was half-formed and desperate. He started with his father's old lawyer, Harold Myers, whose office still held the same mahogany desk and pretentious gold plaques as a decade ago. Lucas hadn't set foot in the place since his father's funeral, and the stale scent of leather and cologne turned his stomach. Harold barely hid his surprise when Lucas showed up unannounced, though the polite smile stayed plastered in place. They exchanged stiff greetings, the kind where words were said, but nothing was meant. Lucas wasted no time on pleasantries, cutting straight to the point. "I need to know if my father ever intercepted letters addressed to me," Lucas said, fingers drumming against his thigh. "Specifically from Sarah Miller." Harold's smile faltered, a flicker of something uneasy darting through his eyes before he smoothed it over. "I'm not sure what you—" "Save it." Lucas snapped, the words coming out sharper than intended. He took a slow breath, forcing calm. Don't lie to me, Harold. I already know. There's a long pause, the lawyer's fingers twitching atop the desk. Finally, Harold sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Your father was concerned about the company's image, he admitted reluctantly. He instructed me to intercept any letters that might pose a risk to the family's reputation. That girl's letters were dealt with accordingly. The confirmation landed like a punch to the chest. Lucas's jaw tightened, fury simmering low and cold. So you forged my signature, he said, voice low. Harold had the decency to look away. Your father's orders, he mumbled. It was for the best. For the best? Lucas echoed, bitterness curling in every syllable. You stole 10 years from me, from my son. Do you understand that? Harold didn't answer. Lucas didn't wait for one. He took the copies of the intercepted letters. Fists clenched so tight, the papers crinkled, and left without a backward glance. He drove to Sarah's apartment, heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The hallway felt longer this time, every step heavy with what-ifs. When she opened the door, eyes weary and posture guarded, he didn't waste a breath. I didn't know, he said, voice rough. My father hid them from me. He thrust the letters forward, the pages trembling between them. These are yours. Sarah stared, confused and wary, but she took the papers slowly, skimming the first page with furrowed brow. Her face shifted with every line, anger melting into disbelief, then something closer to pain. I didn't write that letter, Lucas said softer. I never wanted you, either of you, to think that I didn't care. Her hands trembled, fingers tight on the edges. For a moment, she just stood there silent, before her shoulders sagged, as if the fight drained out her all at once. So it was him, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Lucas swallowed hard, guilt twisting low and aching. Sarah, I am so— Don't, she cut in, voice fragile. She scrubbed a hand over her face, blinking fast. I can't. I need time. He flinched, but nodded. I get it, he mumbled. But please, let me see him. Let me make this right. Sarah hesitated, gaze flicking to hallway where Ethan's voice echoed faintly from his room. After a long pause, she exhaled, shoulders dropping. He deserves to know you, she admitted, voice barely above a murmur. But if you hurt him, Lucas, I won't, he swore too fast, his voice cracking. She looked at him for a breath longer, something brittle and tired in her eyes, before stepping aside. Lucas followed her gaze down the hall, heart thudding unevenly. Ethan was sprawled on the carpet, sorting through a pile of Legos with a frown of concentration. He glanced up, startled when Lucas approached, eyes darting to Sarah for permission. She gave a small nod, biting her lip. Hey! Lucas tried, awkward hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mind if I join? Ethan blinked, then shrugged one shoulder, a tiny, hesitant gesture. Lucas took it as an invitation and sank down, careful not to knock over the half-built castle. They worked in silence for a while, passing bricks back and forth without speaking. Lucas's tie felt too tight, sleeves stiff with starch, but he didn't dare fidget, afraid of breaking the fragile piece. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence with a blunt, Do billionaires even know how to build things? Or are you just good at frowning? Lucas choked, a laugh bursting out before he could stop it. The sound was rusty, unfamiliar, but it made Ethan's lips twitch, almost a smile. Depends on the billionaire, he replied, nudging a red brick forward. But I'm trying to improve my skill set. Ethan snorted, and the tension in Lucas's chest loosened a fraction. They spent the next hour assembling mismatched towers and tiny plastic soldiers, conversation stilted but steady. Ethan's questions came cautiously at first. Favorite food, favorite color. If Lucas's car could really go 200 miles per hour. Lucas answered each one with a mix of honesty and half-hearted jokes, relieved every time Ethan's shoulders inched down a little. Sarah lingered in the doorway, half hidden by the shadows. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes were softer, something wary but not quite hostile in the way she watched them. Lucas caught her gaze once, a question hanging between them, but she looked away too fast to read. By the time Ethan started yawning, the sun dipping low through the curtains, Lucas felt lighter. His throat ached with words left unsaid, apologies and promises he wasn't sure how to make. But for now, sitting cross-legged on Sarah's warm carpet with a half-finished Lego tower between them was enough. As he tucked Ethan in, smoothing the blankets with clumsy fingers, the boy mumbled a sleepy, "Are you coming back?" The words were soft, uncertain, tugging at something deep and painful. "Of course," Lucas said, throat tight, "if it's okay with your mom." Ethan's eyes slipped shut, a tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lucas watched until his breathing evened out, something warm and unfamiliar curling under his ribs. When he stepped back into the hall, Sarah was still there, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were rimmed red, though she tried to hide it. "He likes you," she murmured, tone grudging but not unkind. "I like him too," Lucas replied, voice soft. She hesitated, teeth worrying her lip, then nodded slowly. "We'll figure something out," she said, words careful and brittle. "But I need time." "I know," Lucas promised. "Take all you need." As he left, Sarah's gaze stayed on him, no longer cold, but something hesitant, almost hopeful. The door closed behind him. But for the first time in a decade, Lucas didn't feel completely shut out. The museum was crowded for a Saturday, families milling between exhibits with the kind of easy chaos Lucas had never quite understood. He stuck close to Ethan, watching as the boy darted from one display to the next with wide eyes and hesitant excitement. It was a good kind of chaos, though, the kind that felt warm, not overwhelming. Lucas had half expected Ethan to cling to the edges, shy and uncertain, but the second they passed the dinosaur skeletons, his face lit up. He tugged at Lucas's sleeve, pointing out each plaque and rattling off facts with the kind of earnestness that left Lucas blinking to keep up. "That one's a Spinosaurus," Ethan explained, almost bouncing on his toes. "It could swim and hunt in water. Most people think Rex was the biggest predator, but Spinosaurus was even bigger. Its jaws were like this, huge." He spread his arms wide, nearly smacking a passing tourist in the leg. Lucas bit back a smile, nudging him away from the foot traffic. "That right? I think you might know more about this stuff than the guides do." Ethan flushed, ducking his head, but clearly pleased. "Mom says I'm going to be a paleontologist someday," he mumbled, scuffing his sneaker on the tile. "You'd be great at it," Lucas said without thinking, and the way Ethan's face brightened at that, like it was the first time anyone had said it out loud, left a sharp ache in his chest. They spent over an hour wandering the exhibits, Ethan's nerves easing bit by bit until he was dragging Lucas by the wrist to see a model of a meteor impact. Lucas let himself be pulled, content to follow, even when he found himself nodding along to a ramble about prehistoric ecosystems that might as well have been another language. When Ethan paused to catch his breath, Lucas ruffled his hair, earning a startled blink. "Pretty sure you'd pass any test on dinosaurs," he teased. "Might have to hire you as my science advisor." Ethan's nose scrunched, but he was smiling. "You don't even like dinosaurs," he accused, squinting up suspiciously. Lucas raised both hands in surrender, grinning. "Fair, but I like listening to you talk about them." The words slipped out without thought, but they made Ethan's ears go pink, his shoulders inching up in a mix of flustered and pleased. Lucas tucked the reaction away for later, a quiet kind of victory. They grabbed lunch at the museum cafe, wedged between a group of giggling teenagers and a toddler flinging fries at the floor. Lucas picked at his sandwich, watching Ethan inhale a grilled cheese like he hadn't eaten in days. It was a simple thing, sitting across from him in a too-small booth, but it felt surreal, almost like a memory borrowed from someone else's life. Ethan kicked his feet under the table, glancing up mid-bite. "So why didn't you want me?" he asked, tone light, but eyes flicking nervously to Lucas's face. The question hit like ice water, and for a second, Lucas forgot how to breathe. "I what?" he choked, heart stumbling. "That's what Mom said." Ethan went on, watching the straw in his drink spin. "She said you were too busy and didn't want a family." "So why?" Lucas's hands trembled under the table, and he curled them into fists to hide it, the urge to deny it, to say something that might fix the hurt threading through Ethan's voice, clawed at his throat. But Ethan's gaze was steady, and line felt too close to what his father had done. "I didn't know." Lucas said finally, the words rough and raw. "Your mom, she tried to tell me, but someone made sure I never found out." He paused, dragging a hand over his face. "If I'd known, I never would have stayed away. I promise." Ethan's face stayed blank for a beat too long, then crumpled into a frown. "Oh," he mumbled, shoulders curling in. "So it wasn't true." "Not even close," Lucas swore, leaning forward. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything." The nickname slipped out by accident, but Ethan didn't flinch. He stared down at his half-empty glass, biting his lip before mumbling, "It's okay, I guess." His voice was small, uncertain, but not rejecting, and Lucas exhaled slowly. They spent the rest of lunch in quiet, awkward pauses broken by Ethan's muttered facts about marine reptiles and how they weren't technically dinosaurs. The explanations were clumsy, sometimes tangling mid-sentence, but Lucas hung on to every word, letting the flood of information wash away the sting of the earlier question. Afterwards, Ethan dragged him to the VR exhibit with a grin too smug for a 10-year-old. "Come on," he insisted, practically bouncing. "You can't be that old. It's just a roller coaster." "Just a roller coaster," Lucas echoed dryly, eyeing the headset with no small amount of suspicion. But Ethan's grin widened half a challenge, and Lucas rolled his eyes with a sigh. "Fine, but if I throw up, it's on you." The next 10 minutes were a blur of two real loops and drops, his stomach lurching with every twist. By the time the simulation ended, Lucas stumbled out of the booth, gripping the rail for dear life, while Ethan laughed so hard he nearly toppled over. "You're awful," Lucas grumbled, grimacing at the lingering dizziness. "You should have seen your face," Ethan wheezed, clutching his side. "You look like you were going to cry." "Keep it up and you're walking home," Lucas threatened, though the threat fell flat on the fondness in his tone. Ethan snickered, nudging his arm, and for the first time since they'd met, his smile was wide and unguarded. They headed back to the apartment as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the road. Lucas stopped at a red light, glancing sideways to find Ethan already dozing against a window, face smushed and peaceful. He eased the car forward when the light changed, something warm settling under his ribs. Maybe he was still fumbling, still too raw and unsure, but for now, with Ethan snoring softly in the passenger seat, it felt enough. Back at the apartment, Sarah was waiting by the door, one hand braced against the frame, face pale and tight. She straightened when she saw them, her smile stretched too thin to be convincing. "Have fun?" she asked, voice strained. Ethan, still bleary, just nodded, shuffling inside with a yawn. Lucas moved to follow, pausing when Sarah swayed, catching herself with a shaky breath. "Are you okay?" he asked, brow furrowing. She waved a hand, forcing a smile. "Fine," she mumbled, but her voice wavered, and she blinked rapidly, pressing a hand to her temple. "Just tired. Work's been a lot." Lucas hesitated, watching the way her knuckles whitened against the door. But before he could press, she took a breath, turning away with a clipped "Thanks for today," and disappeared down the hall. Her door clicked shut, but Lucas stood rooted for a moment, unease twisting in his gut. Sarah's smile lingered in his mind, how forced it had looked, the tremble in her hand. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair, but the knot in his chest didn't ease. Sarah stared at the MRI scans, fingers trembling slightly against the cold edge of the desk. The doctor's voice droned on, soft and clinical, outlining terms she barely understood. Glioblastoma, aggressive, limited time. The words blurred, heavy and final, and she gripped the chair's armrest until her knuckles ached. "How long?" she managed, voice brittle. The doctor hesitated, sympathy dulling the hard lines of his face. "Months," he said gently. "Maybe 6 if we start treatment right away." "I'm so sorry." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. The apology didn't matter. Nothing did, except the boy waiting back home, probably bent over a science book or sprawled on the couch with one of his Lego sets. Ethan didn't even know she'd gone to the hospital. She told him she was working late, kissed his forehead, and left before she could change her mind. The weight of it settled in, cold and suffocating. 6 months, maybe. Most of that eaten up by treatments and nausea and hospital beds. Maybe less of the tumor spread faster than they could cut it back. Her fingers dug into her palm, nails biting deep. Ethan would be alone. The drive home blurred by, traffic lights smearing red and green through her windshield. By the time she pulled into the apartment lot, her hands were numb, throat raw from biting back the panic clawing at her lungs. Inside, Ethan was curled on the couch, head tipped back, eyes closed in a half-doze. A book lay open on his chest, pages fluttering with each slow breath. Lucas was beside him, flipping through a chess manual with a frown, his tie draped carelessly over the armrest. The sight was too normal, too soft, and Sarah gripped the door frame hard enough to hurt, trying to keep herself steady. She cleared her throat, and Lucas glanced up, eyes brightening briefly before flicking to Ethan. "We didn't hear you come in," he said quietly. "Hope you don't mind." Ethan wanted to show me how to lose at chess in record time. Ethan snorted without opening his eyes. "You just have to get better," he mumbled, voice slurred with sleep. A laugh slipped out before Sarah could stop it, cracking the tension, and Lucas's smile softened. For a moment, it was easy to pretend the news didn't exist, that 6 months wasn't a countdown ticking down too fast. "I don't mind," she murmured, forcing a smile. "Thanks for keeping him company." Lucas shrugged, trying for casual. "I figure it's the least I could do," he said, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face, brow creasing slightly. "You okay?" She flinched, looking away too fast. "Yeah," she lied, slipping off her shoes and ducking into the kitchen before he could press. "Just tired." She spent the next 10 minutes clattering through the cabinets, fingers shaking too much to manage the dishes properly. Eventually, Lucas followed, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed loosely. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, quieter this time. "Yeah," she repeated, but her voice broke on the word, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, breath hitching. Lucas's face fell, concern overtaking caution. He moved closer, reaching out slowly, like he was afraid she might shatter. "Sarah," he started, hesitant. "What's wrong?" She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the tears back, but they slipped free anyway, hot and humiliating. The lump in her throat ached, too tight to swallow past, and when she spoke, the words came out cracked and unsteady. "I'm dying," she whispered. "They said 6 months, maybe." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas went rigid, all the color draining from his face. His hands fell to his sides, fingers twitching once, then curling uselessly. For a moment, he just stared, uncomprehending, as if the words were a different language. "What?" he choked, voice raw. No, there's gotta be, it's a brain tumor," Sarah interrupted, the confession tearing free with a shaky breath. "They can try surgery, but it's too far along. There's nothing they can do." Lucas swayed slightly, catching himself on the counter. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down heavy and suffocating. He dragged a hand through his hair, eyes wide and wild. You can't be serious," he stammered. 6 months? That's not, I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, voice cracking. "For what?" Lucas snapped, harsher than he meant, and the guilt twisted deeper when she flinched. "For not telling me sooner? For keeping him from me for 10 years and then dropping this on me? How am I supposed to—" "I didn't want him to get hurt," Sarah cut in, voice rising. "You left Lucas. What was I supposed to tell him? That his father was too busy making deals to care. I didn't know." Lucas shot back, hand slamming down on the counter hard enough to rattle the glasses. "I didn't know, Sarah. Your letters never even reached me. I never would have." She covered her face, shoulders trembling. "It doesn't matter," she mumbled, words muffled. "It's too late. I need you to take care of him when I'm gone." The plea hit Lucas harder than any of the accusations, stealing the breath from his lungs. He stared, throat closing, hands useless at his sides. "Of course," he managed, voice rough. "Of course I will." She exhaled shakily, shoulders sagging. "Thank you," she whispered, so soft it barely reached him. "Just please don't tell him yet. Not until I figure out how." Lucas's hands clenched, nails biting into his palms. The urge to argue, to demand more time, to beg her to fight, rose, but her eyes were rimmed red, dark shadows smudged beneath them, and the words died in his throat. He nodded, helpless and aching, and Sarah's face crumpled. She turned away quickly, a hand pressed to her mouth, shoulders curling in. Lucas stared at her back, a dozen half-formed apologies warring in his mind, but none of them felt like enough. He left before he could break down, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, harsh and sterile, and he barely made it to the stairwell before his legs gave out, back sliding down the wall. His hands shook, fists tangling his hair, breath shuddering in and out in uneven gasps. For 10 years he'd stayed away, too angry and bitter to look back, and now the past was catching up too fast to outrun. 6 months. Maybe less, a handful of weeks to try and fix a lifetime's worth of mistakes, and the only person who could tell him how was already slipping away. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut, swallowing hard, but the tears spilled over anyway, burning hot and helpless. Sarah's condition worsened faster than any of them expected. Within weeks, the headaches left her too weak to stand for long, hospital visits stretching from hours to overnight stays. The doctors talked about options, chemo, surgery, pain management, but their voices always dipped at the end, as if trying to soften the blow. Lucas heard the truth beneath the careful words. They were out of time. He took Ethan to the hospital every day after school, carrying bags of books and coloring supplies that went untouched. Ethan didn't complain, but his smiles grew smaller, sentences trailing off with worried glances at Sarah's pale face. Lucas filled the silences with questions about school, dinosaurs, anything to keep the quiet from settling too thick. In the hospital room, Sarah was hooked to too many wires and machines, the steady beeping a cruel reminder that every minute they got was borrowed. She smiled when they came in, though small and tired, and Ethan's face always brightened at the sight. Lucas could hardly stand to watch, the guilt twisting deeper each time. One afternoon, while Ethan slept in the armchair by the window, Sarah beckoned Lucas closer, her fingers trembling faintly on the blanket. "I need a favor," she whispered, voice raspier by the day. "Anything," Lucas said without thinking, pulling the chair closer to her bedside. The words were useless, too late to mean much, but he'd say them 1,000 times if it helped. She reached to the nightstand, fumbling for a leather-bound notebook, edges frayed and cover worn. Lucas took it when she held out, fingers brushing hers. It was heavy, the kind of weight that sank deep, and when he flipped it open, his throat tightened at the sight of Sarah's handwriting filling the pages, soft cursive, slanting slightly, crowded with dates and little hearts in the margins. "It's for Ethan," Sarah murmured, her voice raw. "I started a few months ago when the headaches got bad. It's just things I want him to know, advice, memories." Her breath caught, a faint wheeze, and Lucas squeezed the notebook tighter to stop his hands from shaking. "He'll love it," he said, the words thick but steady. "I'll make sure he reads it. Every page." Sarah's eyes shone, unshed tears catching the dim light. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. "Promise me you'll take care of him," she whispered. "Not just don't send him off to some boarding school or hand him over to nannies. He needs—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together, breathing uneven. "He needs you, not just someone." "I promise," Lucas choked, reaching to cover her hand with his. It was cold, fingers brittle under his palm, and he squeezed gently, throat tight. "I'll be there for him. I swear." Her eyes fluttered shut, a tear slipping free to trace her temple, but her fingers curled slightly in his, grip weak but steady. "Thank you," she breathed, so soft he almost missed it. They stayed like that for a while, the silence filled only by Ethan's quiet breaths and the faint hum of machines. Lucas ran his thumb over her knuckles, words piling up behind his teeth, apologies, regrets, memories that hurt too much to say out loud. But Sarah's breathing evened out, lashes brushing pale cheeks, and he let the silence stand. The next day, Sarah managed to sit up barely, insisting on fixing Ethan's collar when he clambered onto the bed. Her hands were unsteady, but her smile stayed firm as she smoothed out his wrinkled shirt, murmuring something about keeping handsome. Ethan grumbled, cheeks red, but didn't pull away, leaning into her side with a mumbled complaint about embarrassing moms. Lucas watched, throat aching, fingers tied around the notebook Sarah had handed him. He turned it over in his lap, thumb brushing the spine, every word in it weighing heavier than the last. Later, when Ethan insisted on learning how to tie a tie properly, after seeing Lucas fumble with his own, Sarah chuckled softly from bed, eyes half closed. "Your dad's hopeless," she teased, voice faint but warm. Ethan snorted, tugging at the knot Lucas had managed. "I can tell," he deadpanned. "You need lessons, seriously. This looks like a noodle." Lucas raised both hands in surrender. "Hey, I got plenty of other skills," he protested, mock-offended, "like ordering takeout and arguing with my assistant." "Well," Ethan drawled, unimpressed. "Super useful." Sarah laughed, the sound thin but real, and Lucas glanced over in time to see her lips curl, eyes bright with something soft. For a moment, the lines of pain eased, leaving her almost at peace. The sight left Lucas's chest tight, breath short and unsteady. That night, Lucas lingered after Ethan fell asleep on the couch, blanket bunched up to his chin. The nurses came and went with quiet efficiency, adjusting machines, checking monitors. Sarah's breaths came slow and shallow, each one rattling faintly. Lucas sat beside the bed, watching the slow rise and fall, every tick of the second hand counting down too fast. She stirred as dawn broke, lashes fluttering. Her gaze slid to Lucas, unfocused but warm, and her lips curled faintly. He leaned forward, fingers finding hers, rapping gently. She squeezed back, so light he barely felt it. "You're doing good," she mumbled, barely more than a breath. "Ethan's lucky." His throat tightened, and he forced a smile, blinking back the burn in his eyes. "It's all him," he rasped. "I'm just trying to keep up." She huffed a faint laugh, eyes slipping shut again. Her hand stayed limp in his, breath slowing bit by bit, fading into shallow gasps. Lucas held on, fingers brushing her wrist, breaths coming too fast and too uneven. By the time the sun broke through the blinds, painting the room in gold and gray, her hand was still, her lips were parted, face smooth and quiet, a faint smile lingering at the edges. Lucas's chest caved, air catching in his throat, and he hunched forward, forehead pressing to their joined hands, shoulders shaking with each breath. The room was too quiet, the kind that settled deep and empty, and for a long time he didn't move, breaths uneven and broken. The mansion was too quiet, the kind of silence that settled in corners and stretched long into the night, pressing heavy and cold against the walls. Lucas moved through it like a ghost, sleep-deprived and aching, trying to fill the emptiness with anything he could think of. Cooking breakfast, packing lunches, pacing outside Ethan's door when nightmares pulled the boy awake with ragged breaths. He'd moved Ethan into the house the day after the funeral. Sarah's sister had offered to take him in, eyes red and voice thick with sympathy, but Lucas couldn't stomach the thought of letting go. He promised Sarah he'd be there, and for once, he intended to keep that promise. The first few days passed in a blur. Between arranging the funeral and sorting through Sarah's things, Lucas barely had time to breathe. Ethan trailed behind him, quiet and stiff, clutching the notebook Sarah had given him like a lifeline. His eyes stayed rimmed red, but he didn't cry, face too blank for a 10-year-old. At night, Lucas lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, Sarah's last words playing on loop until they blurred together, each one sharp and aching. The guilt sank deeper with every empty room he passed. The sight of Ethan's small figure curled up in a bed too big for him, covers pulled tight to his chin. He tried to fill the days with routine. Breakfast at 7, school drop-off, afternoon snacks, and homework spread across the dining table. It felt clumsy and stilted, each word forced and awkward, but Ethan didn't complain. Mostly, he just stared down at his books, answers quiet and monosyllabic, barely looking up when Lucas asked how school was. The house itself felt hostile, every surface too clean and too cold. Sarah would have hated it, would have brought in plants and bright blankets, piled books on every flat surface. Lucas caught himself staring at the walls too often, fists clenching at the emptiness. He tried to cook once, Fumbling through a recipe for spaghetti, he found in a drawer. It ended in smoke and a half-melted spatula. Ethan's wide eyes peeking over the kitchen island as the fire alarm shrieked. In the end, they ordered takeout in silence, noodles half cold and sticking together. Ethan poking at his plate with a fork. The school call started a week later. Fights on the playground. Skipped homework. Sharp words thrown at teachers. Lucas sat through each conference with his jaw clenched, apologizing and promising it wouldn't happen again. But Ethan's sullen frown never wavered. One afternoon, after the third call in as many days, Lucas tried to talk to him, sitting down on the edge of the bed and forcing a smile. "Hey," he started, voice too light. "What's going on, buddy?" Ethan shrugged, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just didn't feel like doing math." "Is someone bothering you at school?" Lucas pressed, trying to keep the desperation from bleeding through. "You can talk to me, about anything." Ethan's shoulders hunched higher, lips pressed tight. He stared at his lap, refusing to answer, and Lucas's heart sank, frustration tangling with guilt. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words, but every sentence died on his tongue. After a week of dead-end questions and one-word replies, he caved and called a therapist, stumbling through an explanation over the phone while Ethan sat hunched in the next room, shoulders drawn tight. He hated the way it felt, like admitting defeat, but Sarah's notebook was still tucked under Ethan's pillow. Pages dog-eared and worn from nights spent reading by flashlight. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and cheap coffee. The walls painted a too cheerful yellow. Ethan spent the first 2 sessions staring at the carpet, answers clipped and dull, fingers curled tight in his sleeves. Lucas sat outside, hands twisting in his coat, trying to breathe through the anxiety clawing at his chest. The breakthrough came 3 weeks in. A storm thundered outside, rain hammering against the windows, wind howling through the trees. Lucas made hot chocolate, burned his thumb on the kettle, and carried 2 mugs to Ethan's room, knocking gently. The door creaked open, Ethan's face blotchy and tired, eyes rimmed red. He let Lucas in without a word, crawling back onto the bed and drawing his knees up to his chest. Lucas hesitated in the doorway, balancing both mugs, then sighed and settled at the foot of the bed, careful to keep space between them. They sat in silence for a while, the wind howling outside, rain streaking down the glass. Lucas blew at his cocoa, throat tight with all the things he didn't know how to say. "Do you think she'll forget me?" Ethan asked suddenly, voice small and raw. His hands twisted in the blanket, knuckles white. "In heaven, what if she doesn't remember me?" Lucas's chest caved, air catching in his throat. For a second he couldn't breathe, the pain so sharp and immediate it left him reeling. He set the mug aside, wiping a hand over his face, swallowing hard past the lump in his throat. "She could never forget you," he choked, voice cracking. "Not ever. You're her whole world, Ethan. She loves you more than anything." Ethan sniffed, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Promise?" "I promise," Lucas swore, voice unsteady. Ethan nodded, shoulders relaxing a fraction, but his face crumpled a second later, hands flying up to hide it. The sobs came sudden and gut-wrenching, shaking his small frame, muffled into his sleeves. Lucas moved without thinking, scooting closer and wrapping both arms around him, pulling him in tight. Ethan clung back, fingers fisting in Lucas's shirt, face pressed to his chest. "I miss her," he gasped, voice cracking. "I want her back." "I know," Lucas whispered, eyes stinging. "Me too, buddy. Me too." They stayed like that for a long time, Ethan's tears soaking through his shirt, breasts ragged and broken. Lucas held on, running a hand over his back, murmuring soft assurances until the sobs eased into hiccups. Eventually, Ethan pulled back, scrubbing at his face with the sleeve of Lucas's shirt, eyes puffy and red. He sniffed and scowled faintly. "Your cooking sucks," he mumbled, voice thick. "You need lessons." A startled laugh burst out before Lucas could stop it, and Ethan's glare softened at the edges, almost a smile. "Yeah, probably," Lucas agreed, chuckling weakly. "Maybe you can teach me." Ethan snorted, wiping his nose. "Yeah, right. You'd burn cereal." Lucas huffed, shoving at his shoulder lightly, and Ethan's mouth twitched, a half-smile breaking through. For the first time in weeks, the ache in Lucas's chest eased, breath coming a little lighter. That night, after tucking Ethan in, Lucas lingered by the door, watching the way the boy's chest rose and fell evenly, one hand still clutching Sarah's notebook. The house was still too quiet, too empty, but the weight of grief and guilt didn't feel so suffocating. Hope, faint but steady, beat beneath it. He pulled the door shut softly, exhaling slow. He'd keep his promise. Whatever it took, he'd make things right. A year passed, steady and relentless, softening the edges of grief but never quite dulling them. The house felt different now, warmer, lived in. Photos lined the mantel, shelves crowded with paperbacks and half-finished Lego sets. The empty silence had given way to music and muffled laughter, footsteps pounding down hallways and sleepy mumbles over breakfast. Lucas adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, scowling when the knot slipped crooked for the third time. He tugged it loose with a sigh, fingers clumsy and impatient. Before he could try again, Ethan appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with an exaggerated sigh. "You're hopeless," he deadpanned, crossing his arms. "That's like the 5th time." "4th," Lucas corrected dryly. "And it wouldn't be if someone hadn't hidden my clip-ons." Ethan smirked, eyes glinting with mischief. "Maybe it's a sign you need to learn. Or maybe the clip-ons just got tired of being used wrong." Lucas snorted, flicking the tie at him, earning a yelp and a giggle. "Keep it up, smart mouth," he warned, though his tone was light. "Or you're packing your own lunch all week." "Fine," Ethan said with a sniff, brushing invisible dust off his shoulder. "At least I won't burn the toast." The retort slipped out so smoothly that Lucas barked a laugh, the sound startling in the quiet hallway. Ethan's smirk widened into a grin, eyes crinkling at the edges. And for a moment, it was almost easy to forget the months before, hospital rooms and hushed sobs, Sarah's too pale face beneath fluorescent lights. They made out the door with minimal chaos, though Lucas almost forgot the flowers. He balanced a bouquet awkwardly in one hand, guiding Ethan to the car with the other, keys jingling in his pocket. The drive was quiet, sunlight slanting through the windows, warm and soft. The cemetery hadn't changed, rows of headstones stretching under a cloudless sky, a chill threading through the breeze. But Ethan didn't hesitate this time, shoulders squared as he led the way, steps sure and steady. Sarah's grave was shaded by an oak tree, the headstone smooth and simple, her name etched in clean lines. Lucas set the flowers down carefully, brushing a leaf from the stone, fingers lingering a moment too long. Ethan crouched beside him, slipping a folded piece of paper from his jacket. His fingers fumbled with the tape, cheeks pink, but he pressed a note to the headstone with a determined nod, smoothing the edges with both hands. Lucas caught a glimpse of the handwriting, uneven and smudged, a few flowers drawn in the corners. "Is it okay?" Ethan asked, glancing up through his lashes, suddenly unsure. "I didn't want it to look messy." Lucas's throat tightened, a lump forming fast and hard. "She'll love it," he rasped, voice thick. "It's perfect." Ethan relaxed, a soft smile curling his lips. He leaned back on his heels, gaze fixed on the headstone, fingers picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. They stayed like that for a while, the wind rustling the oak leaves, sunlight warming the grass. When Ethan finally moved, it was with a quiet sigh, shoulders easing. He tugged at Lucas's sleeve lightly, tilting his head toward the car. Lucas stood slowly, one last look at the flowers and the note, then turned to follow, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder as they walked. They stopped for ice cream on the way back, Ethan perking up at the sight of the chalkboard menu. He spent 10 minutes debating flavors, brow furrowed in deep concentration, before settling on cookies and cream with rainbow sprinkles. Lucas just ordered black coffee, ignoring the cashier's raised brow. They ate in the park, legs dangling off a bench, pigeons pecking at crumbs nearby. Ethan licked a smear of ice cream off his thumb, eyes narrowed at a particularly bold pigeon edging closer. "Are all birds as dumb?" he asked, flicking a crumb in his direction. "Or is it just city birds?" "Pretty sure it's all of them," Lucas replied, lips twitching. "But city birds just have less shame." Ethan snorted, kicking his feet idly. The sunlight caught on his hair, turning it gold at the edges, and Lucas found himself staring, chest tight with a mix of wonder and something softer. When they got home, Ethan disappeared down the hall, mumbling something about sorting through books. Lucas wandered to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, only to pause when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Sarah's notebook, edges frayed and familiar, sitting on the coffee table. Curious, he picked it up, flipping to the pages slowly. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, ink smudged in places, her handwriting looping and soft. Halfway through, a photo slipped free, yellowed at the edges, corners bent from being tucked between pages. Lucas caught it instinctively, breath catching at the sight. It was him and Sarah, years younger, crammed into a photo booth with arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning wide and carefree. The summer before everything went wrong, her hair tangled by the wind, sunlight dusting freckles across her nose. But what made his throat close was a note scribbled in the margin, words cramped and smudged but clear. "You did good, Dad." Lucas sank onto the couch, fingers brushing the ink, chest aching with the force of it. The room blurred slightly, edges softening, and he had to blink hard, a shaky breath leaving him. The words were simple, no flowery speech or long-winded forgiveness. Just 5 words, small and unsteady, but enough to loosen the knot that had been twisting in his chest for months. He stayed there for a long moment, photo cradled carefully, breath slow and deep. When Ethan poked his head around the corner, brows arching question, Lucas cleared his throat, tucking the photo carefully back into the notebook. "You good?" Ethan asked, tilting his head. "Yeah," Lucas replied, voice rough but steady. "Yeah, I'm good." Ethan's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he didn't push, padding over and flopping onto the couch with a huff. He snagged the remote, flicking through channels of frown, and Lucas chuckled, leaning back against the cushions. For the first time in months, the silence felt warm instead of suffocating, the empty spaces in the house a little less cold. Later that evening, they stopped by the cemetery one last time, twilight painting the sky in shades of gold and blue. Lucas took Ethan's hand, squeezing gently, and Ethan squeezed back, the touch small but certain. They stood by Sarah's grave for a while, the breeze cool and soft, flowers rustling quietly. Lucas traced the edges of the headstone with his thumb, exhaling slowly. "We're going to be okay," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I'll make sure of it." Ethan leaned into his side, cheek pressed to his sleeve, eyes fluttering shut. The tension in Lucas's chest unwound slowly, replaced by something warm and steady, hope threading through the ache. They left as stars began to peek through the dark, fingers still twined together, footsteps light and sure. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.